Welcome to the IHR Transport and Mobility History Seminar. My name is Lewis. I'm a researcher at the University of Essex and the Essex Business School. Just to flag that our first seminar of 2023 will be on the 26th of January, which will be a Meet the Archivist session for the Aviation and Aerospace Archives Initiative. I don't believe we have a URL for that at the moment, but keep an eye on the website and we'll send that on our various channels. Getting to tonight though, so I am very, very happy to introduce Murray Seccombe. Sorry if I've got that wrong. Is that right, Murray?
It's Seccombe. That's pretty good.
Excellent. So Murray has just finished a PhD at Lancaster, looking at highway law and governance in the 17th century. He did a BA Classics at Oxford and then went on to work in the charities sector, particularly in places like for community transport. He then went back to university study at the University of Lancaster to complete a master's, and it leads us to his just finished PhD. So, Murray, the floor is yours.
Right. Okay, so just bear with me while I share my screen. I think it's right in the middle of my presentation, which is always a good thing to do. But let's go there. Okay, can everybody see that, or if at least one person could confirm? I can see a couple of nodding heads. Good. Okay, so good evening, everybody. Welcome to a deep dive into the 17th century and into a very small part of Yorkshire, but actually one of the largest parishes in England at the time. And today I'm going to look at three sets of questions which ran through my 7 years of research. So the first one is the received account of the legal framework for managing highways before 1700 itself in need of repair? Secondly, what were the manorial mechanisms for managing road nuisances and repairs? How long did they last and how effective were they? And given the input of manorial institutions, where does management of infrastructure fit into theories of state formation in early modern England? There are three strands of historiography to this research. The first one is perhaps the more obvious one, the history of transport and communications, highway law and development. And the pioneering work of the Webbs remains the single most coherent account of how road management fits into the development of English local government. This is principally set out in the rather wonderful story of the King's Highway from 1913, I think it is, but also figures prominently in other volumes in the series. However, their stereotypes in this period of inefficient surveyors, justices, and road labourers have been challenged by a stream of work, going back to John Charters at Leeds in the 1970s, Dorian Gerhold, who's still working on various things, and a guy called Mark Brachet at Plymouth, the title of whose book in 2015, Land Travel and Communication in Tudor and Stuart England, achieving a joined up realm, really was quite ambitious for what transport was about in this period. Now, secondly, is our studies of manorial governance. It is now a commonplace in early modern studies that manorial courts not only survived beyond 1600, but found new roles and purposes. Brodie Waddell's survey, Governing England through the Manor Courts 1550 to 1850, highlighted how infrastructural issues, including roads, paths, and bridges, became the dominant focus for these courts. And thirdly, the turn of the millennium saw a reconceptualization of the early modern state as multifaceted, working across multiple institutions, and thus repositioning the parish and township as significant players in the development of state power. The work of Steve Hindle on vestry government and Mike Braddick at Sheffield on a taxonomy of state activity are particularly relevant. But hitherto, these strands have not been integrated into a new explanatory framework for highway management. The impression remains that highway governance before 1700 was ineffective and unfit for purpose. Part of the problem, in my opinion, has been over-reliance on county-level data from quarter sessions. Records of disputes and challenges to authority intrinsically reflect the anxieties of the county bench and not necessarily the everyday problems facing office holders at the grassroots. Indeed, parish records for surveyors are rare until the 18th century, and you can see there that my case study is no exception. This study has been based on two very different sources. Today, I will mainly be discussing the manorial records from the huge manor of Wakefield in the West Riding. I share, like I also have, access to constables' accounts from an important township within the manor, which happen to include unusually early evidence of spending on road repairs financed from the rates. And I will be talking about that a little bit later on. So the paper records, so a second piece of good fortune, is actually two sets of records, one on paper and one on parchment. The paper rolls are far more informative and include the original submissions by township constables of orders and bylaws, and not just of amercements or fines, which are the only ones to appear on the parchment rolls. The result for Halifax parish, my case study area, is a corpus of nearly 6,000 orders, bylaws and fines related to highways at the court between 1605 and 1699. This is a real wealth of information. And the same paper records list the names of people officiating, which means that we can build up a detailed picture of how decisions were made by and affected people in each township. So I need to give you a bit of an overview of my case study area. And I don't know how many people will know the area of Calderdale and Halifax. It has a very distinct geography and geology, as on this modern relief map used by Calderdale Council, whose area, broadly, roughly about 90%, coincides with the ancient parish of Halifax. And the position of the town, which is not on the main river, the River Calder, is at the Red Star. The parish was large. It's roughly half the size of the Isle of Wight, and with a population of around 20,000. So this was a heavily populated area in the 17th century. In blue, you can see the floodplain of the River Calder and its tributaries. And in our period, as is still the case, susceptibility to dramatic flooding made it unsuitable for housing and arable agriculture, which partly explains why Halifax is not actually on the main river. The brown area, on the other hand, the river did provide plentiful power, water power, for textile mills. The brown areas are land over 300 meters, over 1,000 feet, which provided summer grazing, especially for cattle in this period. In between are terraces in various shades of green, relatively flat, shelving meadowland, which is where the majority of the population eked out a living based on pastoralism, pastoral agriculture, and woolen cloth making. Now, this wasn't terrain suited to the wagons and coaches that were becoming an increasingly common sight on roads across the English lowlands. The land here was crisscrossed by packhorse trails paved with large slabs of local gritstone known as causey stones. Highways were designed for movement on foot or hoof. Wheeled vehicles, other than farm carts, were relatively rare, especially in the upland parts of the parish. The second major feature of my case study area is that 19 of the 21 townships at the time came within the jurisdiction of the manor of Wakefield, and its two centres for court, Leet, which are in Halifax, which is, I hope you can see my pointer, it's just there, and at Brighouse, and the dividing line was the black line down here, and there were in fact some other townships outside the parish that attended in Brighouse. However, you can see how the parish actually mostly comes within a single court leet. And this offered them opportunities for a joined up approach to managing their roads. Again, on this map, the main roads show up. There's two roads that were on, excuse me, Ogilby's road maps of 1675. There's a north-south route coming from down from Keighley, heading down towards Barnsley and London. That actually goes through the town centre. And then there's a rather more venerable route following roughly a Roman road coming from Chester toward York. So goes through Rochdale, goes through Elland or near Elland, and then heads off towards York. A third very important road from the parish is actually this one, coming from Burnley in Lancashire through the Upper Calder Valley, which is here, down through Halifax, and then east to Wakefield. So, to get on to my findings, and we'll start with the law. You can read that, but it is slightly difficult. So the point is, this is a excerpt from the first printed guide for manorial courts by Winkin de Worde, who was a successor of Caxton. And the big thing about this is there was already a knowledge and a tradition of dealing with road problems. I'll relieve you from reading that. The offences identified in the manuals are a whole series of unpleasant nuisances and obstructions, which I won't entirely go into, that occupiers of land should deal with on the roads which have butted their own land. And this is really rather well sort of dealt with in Emily Cockaine's Tour de Force, Hubbub, Filth, Noise and Stench in England, 1600 to 1770. Now that's in an urban context. We're mostly dealing with a rural context in the parish of Halifax. The crucial mechanism for manorial courts in Wakefield was one that's actually not dealt with in so much detail in these manuals. And that's the option of setting pains or bylaws, not just to deal with nuisances, but to order repairs or improvements to roads, drains, and other kinds of infrastructure. They also had to take note of the statutory rules. In 1555, leets were given specific powers to monitor repairs under an act that authorised a new post of surveyor to be appointed every Easter, and 4, later 6, statute Labour days for parishioners to repair roads leading to any market town. Now, in most conventional accounts, justices are accorded the prime role in monitoring parishes, and they were able to present roads on their own view, to arbitrate disputes between parishes and so forth. However, their interventions were far fewer where leet courts were still operating and active, as was the case in Wakefield. A frontline role for manorial courts actually sat badly with the Webb's thesis that these courts were in decay by the end of the 16th century. As we shall see, responsibility for roads gave fresh impetus to the leet across the parish of Halifax. The Tudor statutes weren't actually reformed until the second half of the 17th century. And only gradually were lines of accountability and powers for parish officers clarified. A radical Cromwellian reform to allow repairs funded by highway rates was revoked in 1660. Two revisions under Charles II were not terribly successful. They strengthened justices' powers to some extent, but only included temporary rating provisions, which actually lapsed after 3 years. A complete overhaul took place under William III in the 1690s, after which surveyor appointments had to be approved by justices and reports made to them every 4 months at special highway sessions. Powers to set rates became permanent, but theoretically still dependent on justice approval. and the Acts encouraged road widening and signposting. Well, the main focus clearly moved to justices and sessions at the end of the 17th century. Powers for manorial courts under the Tudor Acts actually remained in place for another 75 years. So how did the manorial court in Halifax respond to statutory stimulus? Just let you read that. Well, they did respond, and this order comes from April 1563 to the court in Halifax, just after the second Tudor statute. And the order instructs township constables to give warning for the mending of the highways according to the virtue of the statute. A nice phrase, I think. The 1550 Act actually authorised church wardens as well as constables to do this job, but the designation of constables underscores that the township, and constables were always related to a township, was the accepted unit of administration within the large parish of Halifax. And here, and this is the first time I've gone into the records, is actually an order for statute duty in a township called Barkisland, which is on, it's a township which is actually crossed by the York to Chester Road, by one of those important roads. 6 common day works were set to begin on the 11th of May, which happens to be a Wednesday. Why, I don't know. There you go. One of the men appointed to be an overseer of these common day works, so that's a surveyor, is somebody called William Horton. Now, he was the father of someone who was actually a justice later in the 17th century. So these are important people within that particular township. However, orders for statute duty are actually quite rare at any time within these records, and they virtually disappear after 1630. There are some more references, and there are actually some outside the parish, but close to the parish. But within the parish, they certainly declined. And that's of a piece with what seems to have happened with surveyors. So what I did was, there's a tradition that surveyor appointments were reported to the court. They didn't have to be, but they seem to have been in the early part of the century. The townships in brown are ones that reported their appointments to the court 70% of the years concerned. I know there's only 15, 16 years here, but most of them, many of them were doing it quite regularly. And there's only one there, Sorby Soyland, which is actually one township. It's a joint township, which didn't report at all. However, go along to the 3rd quarter of the century, and you'll see that the whole colour scheme changes. There's only one township, which is well to the east, further right in the far east of the parish, called Hipperholme, which was still reporting in 70% of the years. And there is no evidence at all in any records for the appointment of surveyors in the west of the parish that attended the Halifax court. What we need to do next is to look at the presentments, though, that were made to the court. These come in the form of constables' bills. Now, this is my base data, and each township had to bring one of these reports to the court with their list of bylaws. Here we have them. We pay so and so to do so and so. Which regularly include highway orders. And there are signatures then. So here is this is North Hareham Township. Here they are appointing their overseers, their surveyors, there's 4 of them. And they also had 4 presenters who confirmed that this bill presented by the constable was accurate. And then there are 5 juror signatures who are signing off the whole thing as a formal record. And with this data, I was able to start doing some statistical work on the amount of activity across the century. And you'll see there are some peaks. The blue columns are Halifax, the red ones are for Brighouse, and Halifax appears to have rather more. However, this is partly because so many of the ones that came to Halifax Court were from Halifax town itself. And once I strip those out, first of all, you'll see that there's much more even picture, not quite the same peaks. You'll also see that while the Brighouse Court, the numbers remained fairly consistent, round about 3 presentments per session per township. In Halifax, they dwindled and dropped sharply, particularly after the mid-century. What I did was to develop categories, 7 categories of highway presentments. And across the whole century, nearly 60% of them were for general repairs, unspecified repairs, while statute duty, the one at the bottom here, represented less than 1%. The vast majority of orders apportioned liability in terms of individuals' tenure of land adjacent to a way or path. The 3 other significant categories of presentment: nuisance, inter-township, and trespass. Nuisances occurred across both courts, but inter-township presentments are almost entirely in the west of the parish in the Halifax court, while orders for trespass, that's for people making a way over private ground, were almost entirely in the east at the Brighouse court, and I am going to come back to that. In the orange column, we have details of amercements, and you can see how few there were compared with the orders. Only 1 in 8, less than 12.5%, were actually amercements. And I'll just show where those took place. They are almost entirely in one township. So no other township managed more than 50 amercements in 100 years, whereas in Halifax town, they managed 415. And that's 57% of all the amercements in the parish. Outside the town, the low level of punitive action indicates a general acceptance of personal and collective obligations, and that's important. The distribution, therefore, of what are called pains, orders, bylaws, is very, very different. This map shows a concentration in Halifax, which is there, and in 3 townships to the east. There's also a fairly strong level of presentments in the Upper Calder Valley and in Sorby and Soyland. This particular area, which looks like a blank on the map, is a former hunting park, which was dismantled in the 15th century, had a very small population and only 1 minor road crossing it. So perhaps not surprising, there wasn't very much going on in there. And there's also less activity, generally speaking, in the south of the borough, which was more agricultural, less industrial. Now, strength of manorial regulation was in allowing townships considerable autonomy in setting their own priorities. So what I'm going to do is look at the 3 busier areas within the parish. So there they are in colours. Halifax itself, which will be last. The Upper Calder Valley I'll deal with second, and we're actually going to deal first with these 3 townships over here, which, if you'll remember, had very high levels of manorial activity, of high levels of presentments taken to the manorial court. This is a line chart, rather, of the level of activity by these three townships, Hipperholme, North Hareham and Shelf, and this is per session. You'll see that actually they're relatively similar, typically between 3 and 6 highway presentments per session. And they even all rise together at the end of the century. Presentments predominated in all three areas of the Easter court. There were 2 courts a year, Easter and Michaelmas, Michaelmas being October. And Easter was big in this area because they earmarked roads for repair in the summer season. It was just after the appointment of surveyors, which was more common in this area, and just before the repairing season, if you like. Michaelmas orders were more likely to be about clearing drains, cutting hedges, that sort of thing. This area, one of the important things about it was that it was on the Yorkshire coalfield. The actual geological fault comes down to the west of North Hareham, and Shelf and North Hareham were both heavily mined and quarried well into the Victorian period and even into the 20th century. Now, the location of road repairs on this map are shown in blue in Shelf, in green in North Hareham. The thicker the line, the more the work. And it's clear that these were not predominantly on 2 main roads to Bradford from Halifax, one through North Hareham this way, and one going through North Hareham and then through Shelf. That way they both head towards Bradford. They do, however, occur close to the pits themselves and to quarries to a certain extent. The black disc being for coal and the brown for stone. So their approach towards managing roads was actually about managing the overlapping interests of landholding farmers and miners. And indeed, some of the local people would have had interests in both sectors. The miners needed roads and tracks maintained, often paved with stone, to get horse loads of coal onto the larger roads and from there to places like Halifax. Farmers, on the other hand, needed their land protecting from damage to drainage caused by mining and traffic. Now, in terms of protecting against trespass, we'll go on to the next map. These show where orders, these are pinpoints, where the orders that I could locate was. Very often these orders were attached to field names, which are difficult to recover. So the map shows orders brought to court to deter trespass onto enclosed land by pack horses and travellers detouring from roads, especially in wet weather. The larger the disc, the more frequent the orders. And they are clearly most evident in the low-lying township of Hipperholme, down to the southeast, which had some of the best arable land in the parish. The toolkit of manorial regulation was particularly good at reconciling local economic interests in contested spaces. However, there is evidence that repairing roads offered more protection than these bylaws. And there's actually only one case of somebody being fined for breach of one of these in 100 years. So this graph shows a dynamic between prohibitive bylaws and repairs in one township, Hipperholme. When repairs in blue fell to a relatively low level in the middle of the century, that's the blue bars, the prohibitions rose. Conversely, when in the last part of the century there was a lot more repairs going on in blue, then there tended to be fewer orders against trespass. And that shows this is a township that is learning, if you like, how to manage its roads in everybody's interest. It's an interesting one. So I'm going to turn to another micro study area, which is the Upper Calder Valley. 3 townships, a village called Heptonstall, one or two people may know, Stansfield and Wadsworth. And it's immediately apparent that cases were fewer overall with this drop in the mid-century, only between 1 and 3 per court session. And even the spike in the green line for Stansfield in the 1680s may be misleading. What they did was actually list a whole lot of roads for repair without allocating anybody as responsible, which means that it was unenforceable in the court. So it seems to have been a way of announcing road repairs rather than actually issuing an order on somebody as being liable for it. Leaving that aside, in terms of which roads were targeted in this area, mapping through GIS is quite instructive. So what I did was to develop a system of thinner and thicker lines depending on the frequency of presentment on particular roads. And that built up a picture of priorities for the townships. This is one which is simply built up from the presentments that townships issued within their own borders, but it's within the 3 townships borders. And it shows some attention to major roads over to Colne and to Burnley in Lancashire, along the highway from Halifax, which is this one, goes through Hebden Bridge, just at that point, which is where I happen to live. It also shows some local routes of importance. One went alongside the River Calder here, and another one went up from a town called Todmorden up to the county boundary at Stuyperdon, going towards Burnley. Action through the Manor Court helped to connect communities across the county boundary. And a particular thing, I think, is that this was a very big area for woolen cloth fulling, important to local people here, but also there is movement of cloth for finishing and yarn across the county border, even at this date. So there's a measure of economic integration going on long before the connectivity that's usually associated with turnpikes and canals, and eventually railways. This is another map, but this time of the presentments that these same 3 townships made against each other and against other townships, against people or townships collectively outside their own boundaries. This brings out much more clearly these lines of communication to Lancashire in 3 directions, to Todmorden, to Burnley and to Colne, as well as eastwards towards Halifax down there. So that is very much connected, I think, with the textile industry, and it's in contrast with the approach taken in the mining areas. So we've got an economic explanation for 2 very different patterns of what was going on. If I now come to Halifax, things start to get slightly trickier. The most striking characteristic here is the volatility of activity at the manorial court. We have 2 huge spikes where there was around about 20 presentments per session being taken to the manorial court. It's broken down there into blue for pains, for bylaws and orders, and red for amercements. And there's even one 5-year period after in the Restoration where the amercements, where the fines exceeded the bylaws. And that's the only place where that happens. About 30% of all presentments brought to the court in Halifax are amercements. Here, looking at the geographical situation, you have Halifax Township and the town over here in the east. And that is where almost all the action at the court takes place. And this concerns the town centre streets and central facilities such as Market Hall, corn shop or corn market, cloth markets, linen and wool and what are known as the wool shop, which was the dealing area for wool and cloth, a name which is still there in the town of Halifax today. Colouring in blue is for the most frequent colouring in purple is for the most frequently presented areas, which are broadly speaking the main road north and south, and also a road going east and west, which is actually the road between the road to Wakefield is in the east. Now, a small number of main routes into town were cited for repair by the constable, and those are shown in green, but not nearly as many, and noticeably none in the entire century on the road westwards to Burnley, although we know it was an important road for the people in western townships. If these were repairable by statute duty, no evidence survives, and it is at least possible that taxation was used. There's no indication in the records of wheeled vehicles, although it's possible that the north-south route may have been viable by cart. The focus in Halifax is clearly inward looking, and only a few orders were lodged against other townships in red. It didn't seek to control the other townships. In fact, one of the sets of roads taken to court was in South Harram, which was a township outside this, outside the court leet area. So there are these erratic phases of orders and amercements, suggesting to me that no single strategy was accepted for managing the streets. And it seems probable that it was the rapid turnover of tenants and landlords that made the usual manorial appeal to obligation through tenure much less practicable in the town. Now, they did try other methods, and bylaws were particularly, there are more bylaws than almost any other place in the parish. What I mean by bylaws is rules against various things. So some of these are fairly disgusting, about laying straw or carrion or any other filthy things in Northgate in 1629. And there's a lot about the removal of animal dung. But the problem here seems to be a lack of consistency. So we've got rules about taking it away within a day, within 6 days, within 10 days, within one night, and within 2 days. And it's really difficult to see how this could ever stick, as it were. In the 1650s, there was a rather more interesting experiment with bylaws and a more concerted campaign to keep streets cleansed and repaired by individuals. Once again, however, the size and the nature of the penalty varied, and there is no indication that amercements followed the tariffs set. These bylaws themselves seem to have lapsed at the Restoration. The contrast with the out townships to the west and east could not be starker. The evidence points to the difficulty of using traditional manorial orders in an environment as hectic and unstable as Halifax. The organisation shown by another rather better known court leet in managing the streets of Manchester was never achieved, and that is an interesting comparison. Anyway, at this point, we need to turn back to the connection between manorial governance and the early modern state. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It's an excerpt from a Quarter Sessions order from 1638, just before the First Civil War. And it says, "Forasmuch as this court is informed that the inhabitants of Fixby were formerly presented in the court leet, and a pain was imposed upon them to repair the said way, which still depending there, this court doth therefore order that all proceedings in this court, in the Court of Sessions, shall be stopped, and that they proceed upon the pain aforesaid in the court leet, because," this is the key phrase, "it had the priority." So there's a double meaning to priority here. It's priority in the sense that it was already dealing with it first, But there's also, it's a loosely used word, it also suggests the importance of the court leet in relation to the Court of Sessions. So let's have a look at how governance worked at the court leet. People attended the court in different roles. So there were some manorial staff, but probably rather few, probably the deputy steward, a bailiff, perhaps an usher. It was from the staff, from the townships that most of the people came. So it was one constable for every township attending the court. There were 2 courts in Brighouse and Halifax. There were 13 jurors at each court. There were at the Michaelmas court, the constables were doubled because the old one and the new one both had to turn up. And then there were these people called presenters, usually 4, but 2 in some of the smaller townships, actually up to 6 in Halifax itself. And their job was to confirm that the constable's bill, the constable presenting various people, they confirmed the veracity of the bill. And then the jurors confirmed it as a formal record. Surveyors, officers and surveyors didn't attend. Nevertheless, it still meant that 150 people, and they were in fact all men, could attend the 2 annual court sessions. This was a representative slice of the better off of the parish, and in fact between 10 and 30% of male adults attended the court leet at least once in their lifetime in a formal role. I'll just briefly show how I got the names. A lot of analytical work on this. Perhaps we've seen all this already. Declaring the overseers of the highway. Here's a constable, James Brooksbank, signing his name. 4 presenters, could be signed, could be written, difficult to say. And then 4 jurors in this case, signing off the whole bill. And this one is almost certainly on a lot of the orders will be on the other side of the piece of paper. The court, the steward would also be keeping a record, and one of the things he did would be to list the people attending. So I've got actually a double role, because his list would include, and this is one from Michaelmas, would include the retiring constable, the presenters, and the name of the person chosen to be the next constable. That's actually all in Latin, but it's fairly easy. So from this, you get a lot of names, and it's possible to marry some of these up with taxation records to get an idea of the social profile. This map is based on the same townships used earlier for the case studies, plus Sorby and Soyland, which is the one in the centre of the parish. The average half tax for office holders is either darker, meaning that they've got more halves on average, or it's lighter, such as in the Upper Calder Valley, where the tax status of office holders was almost the same as the population at large. And generally speaking, the number of people with more than 1 half in those Upper Calder Valley are very, very few indeed. This was the poorest part of the parish. And Halifax and the eastern townships were the richest. But the office holders were above average in all areas. And because I've got a load of signatures, we're also able to look at the literacy rates. And the literacy rates in the Upper Calder Valley are much, much higher than anywhere else, just as a poorer standard of education, poorer access to education. So, participation, I think, is one of the key aspects of the manorial courts. And even if many of the office holders were generally better off, the manorial court did encourage broad participation I mean, for those who are involved in transport planning at the moment, this is participation most people would envy, I think, the levels of participation in transport planning in the 17th century. But we'll perhaps come back to that in the Q&A. And this was especially because of these presenter positions. It deepened the amount of participation. Office holders actually also figured disproportionately in orders to repair. Many of them were freeholders or substantial land occupiers. And if they had more land, they tended to have more roads in which they were obliged to repair under the principle of tenurial responsibility. Participation, however, made the court flexible and responsive. There was a real sense of local control of the agenda and few signs of intervention by manorial lords or justices. But this was a century of change, and the manorial court was subject to a number of changes. There was growing social and economic polarization in this period. Some of these were already happening by the beginning of the century, but they certainly accelerated. And the Civil War sharpened some of the processes. The most prominent people in each township sought ways to manage fiscal and administrative demands from central and county government. And it's clear from my other source, the Sowerby Constable's accounts, that a vestry had coalesced by the 1650s, dominated by a small, wealthy elite. Vestrymen signed off increases in the use of constable rates to fund road repairs, to supplement repairs through personal liability. And I'll just show one graph, one rather complex graph, based on the analysis of spending in Sowerby, which is in the left-hand scale, one that rises to 14, and the number of presentments made to the leet, which is on the right-hand scale. So the presentments are in grey, and these disappear towards the end of the century, whereas the spending, initially at rather a low level, does actually rise to a relatively significant level by the end of the century per year. And this is a good example of change being forced from below. Highway taxation was firmly embedded in Sowerby well before the Highways Act of 1692 put it on a firm footing. So, beginning to think about the state. The approaches taken by Braddick and Hindle clearly have much in common, and you can see a couple of quotations there. The state was not limited to policies, in their view, was not limited to policies set by actors and institutions at the centre. Governance was about negotiation between political actors across institutions, and local institutions could play a key role in shaping policies and practice. In their discussions of the state, both identify indicators that support the case for framing manorial regulation of infrastructure as an aspect of state activity, although neither of them actually does it. This is where I'm trying to extend their argument. So Hindle starts with characteristics of empowerment, and these are clearly evident in approaches to managing highways in Halifax. Participation was exceptionally rich. Political change, especially after the Civil Wars, led to a convergence of township practices and values that could meet or even exceed statutory objectives for managing road infrastructure, even if the methods used in the case of Sowerby were non-statutory. They were using taxation, even though there was no particular authorization to do so. Go to Braddick. He has 3 yardsticks for legitimacy. And townships at the leet were able to cite statutory law when it suited them, but they could also draw on a reservoir of communal obligation based on personal liability. And this is really very closely to what Braddick says about justifiability in terms of current beliefs. It appealed, the appeal was very strong. So they were able to adopt a hybrid approach, which achieved high levels of consent and generated little resistance, apart, arguably, from the problematic case of Halifax town itself. So to draw this to a conclusion, really, I think there are four things I came out of all this work with that I want to put to you tonight. So manor courts provided useful mechanisms for managing highways, especially before the regulatory reforms of the 1692 Highways Act, and indeed the early statutes required them to implement the statutes. Manor courts were adaptable and responsive to local conditions. Opportunities to participate in manorial processes reinforced ties of customary obligation despite the stresses of civil conflict and socio-economic change, possibly because of the stresses of civil conflict and socio-economic change. But this is a time when communal obligations at the local level were actually particularly strong. Contrary to the accepted historiography, governance of local infrastructure through communal institutions could perform coherently and effectively in meeting the needs of an industrialising area in early modern England. And finally, I would put it to you that the contribution of communal courts to managing highways in this period constitutes a component of state activity in the sense that Hindle and Braddick talk about it, and that this merits further scholarly attention. And that's where I'm going to draw it to a close. There will be on this presentation a list of my main sources. I've mentioned all of those, I think, except Brooks, Christopher Brooks's work on law, politics and society, which I think is very good reading. And just a few acknowledgements to my supervisors, to the special collections in Leeds, which is where the manorial documents are, and a picture of a 17th century road. Thanks very much indeed.